financialargument.net.
The financial and political opinions expressed in this video are not necessarily of Financial Argument or its staff. Opinions expressed in this video do not constitute personalized investment advice and should not be relied on for making investment decisions.
Hi, Dave. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing fine. And I wanted to start off with what's going on in Europe. We hear slow growth in Germany. We hear the EU is in trouble. We also understand the Brexit is going on. You're out there on the front lines. What have you been hearing about the economy out in Europe and Germany and Italy and everywhere else?
Well, slow growth in Germany is the least of the problems. Germany is headed toward a titanic crisis because you have the anti-growth faction in the government. You have the CDU, the so-called Christian Democrats, moving toward an alliance with the Green Party. So you have the nuclear exit. You have an exit from coal. Coal is the major source of electrical production in Germany. Then they're going to be dependent on the Nord Stream 2 for oil and gas from Russia. And that's a big political question mark given the anti-Russian sentiment among some of the leading parties in Germany. And then you also have a complete destruction of the auto industry underway in Germany. So German productivity is down for the first time in many, many years. The poverty rate is up. You look at France. France is run by an incompetent banker who clearly doesn't know what the hell he's doing. Macron got himself in big trouble by trying to increase taxes on the most vulnerable part of the population, the truck drivers and farmers who are going to have to pay more for gasoline for this phony man-made climate change Paris agreement. So he's in trouble. You mentioned Brexit. May is trying to renegotiate again, and I don't think the European Union bureaucracy are going to do that, which means that the whole London-based banking operation of the European Union is either going to shift to Frankfurt or the British are going to try and run some kind of a scam to maintain control of it. And it's extremely weak. And just going back to Germany, Deutsche Bank continues to be a zombie bank. Big losses again in the last quarter of last year. So I think the situation in Europe politically is extremely weak. The Merkel at the Munich Security Conference last week said Europe has to be prepared to go it alone without the U.S. Well, I don't know if they can do that, first of all. Secondly, it's clear that Trump's pressure on Europe as he's moving toward a solution with China, the likelihood of tariffs against European cars and certain other things have the Europeans completely paranoid. And at the same time, the European Union is attacking China when the Chinese are coming in with money to invest in Europe. So I think it's a mess. Politically, the only nation that's stable, and I think Americans will find this ironic, is Italy, because Italy has a government which says we're not going to be blackmailed by the European Union. We're not going to go along with the European Union banking policy, and we're going to invest in our own country. And this has the EU bureaucrats with their panties in a bunch, but it has the Italian people feeling very confident, and the growth rate in Italy is starting to move up again, because what few people realize is that Italy is actually a highly industrialized country with an aerospace sector, an auto sector, machine tool sector, but it's been held hostage by the EU.
So do you think the EU, you think they're the ones who are in trouble?
The EU is in trouble as an institution because it's a fraudulent institution. There is no such thing as Europe. If you take away sovereignty from nations and tell them that the power to make their budgets rests with a handful of bureaucrats in Brussels, and that the local legislatures, the national legislatures, no longer have the power of the purse, you're going to have a catastrophe. And that's the problem with the EU from the beginning. They rushed into the euro. They brought in countries at par values who couldn't really match up, like Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and so on. And now they're trying to expand it. At the same time, they're totally subservient to the policies of the British and Barack Obama. And so it's an artificial institution. The nations of Europe could do pretty well on their own. the idea that you need EU bureaucrats to make sure there's no war going on in Europe is silly. So they're signing away sovereignty. They have no control over anything. The militaries here are very weak, except France has still an independent military, but who knows what Macron will do with it. Maybe he'll turn it against the truckers and farmers in France. So I think it's a dodo institution. It's doomed to failure. But the reason it's able to stay in business is that no political leadership in Europe outside of Italy, and a European nation, no political leadership has the guts to actually identify the problem, which is the giving up of sovereignty. This is a key issue because Trump has made this an important point, and he was ridiculed at his UN General Assembly speech last September, but what he said was absolutely true, that a nation must have sovereignty. Governments must have representatives who act in the interests of the whole nation. And if you don't have that, if you have political parties that represent different factions and groups, and as in the US, trying to turn it into identity politics, you lose a sense of coherence for a nation. And once you lose that, you lose the ability to mobilize to do what's necessary. And that's what's plaguing Europe.
So if we take the UK, for example, the EU they put together a deal and they said, listen, you accept this deal or that's it. That's the only thing that we have here. And we see the UK, the parliament is saying, no, we don't want this deal. The people are saying we don't want this deal. And it looks like the EU is not really budging. And you hear a lot of fear-mongering going on, like if you don't accept the deal, the economy is going to fall apart, you're going to enter a recession, there'll be riots, there'll be all these different types of things going on in the UK if you don't accept this deal. I mean, are they projecting anything, or do you think the UK will be fine if they break away with no deal?
Well, I don't think they're fine. I think that they've depended for too long on the financial power of the City of London, the offshore banking, the Jersey Island, the Guernsey Islands, the shadow banking system, which allows London to control things such as derivatives markets, currency trading, and so on. Now, without that position, that favorable position in the EU, that will hurt England. At the same time, they have a shrinking manufacturing sector. So they've got a lot of problems. But the people of the United Kingdom voted against the European Union. They voted to leave because a lot of those problems were made worse by the policy prescriptions of the EU. Now you have the Tony Blair faction. Why this guy isn't in prison for his war crimes in the Iraq War is beyond me. But Blair is pushing Labour to get them to break or to have a new vote on Brexit. And it looks like Corbyn may be submitting to that. And then, of course, as you mentioned, what Juncker and the bureaucrats in Brussels are saying is that we don't care about your internal problems. You have to come up with solutions. And if you don't do what we want, we'll cut you off. So they are, in a sense, being blackmailed by the EU for their decision, the decision of the people of England to break with them. I think what they should do is go ahead with Brexit, tell the EU to take a long walk off a short pier or something like that, and then appeal to Trump and say, look, we want an agreement with you. We'd like to be a partner without having to carry the EU on our back. And a part of that deal should be the regulation of the British banking system. So the country can survive, but it also has the other problem, which is that Trump knows damn well that the British intelligence agencies were involved in running the whole Russiagate story. So you'd have to get some kind of clarity on that. But I think the decision was right to break with the European Union. It's sort of the question of do you break with them before they sink, or do you wait till they sink to break? And I think that's the question that's coming up in Germany right now. There's a great deal of dissatisfaction in Germany with the political class as a whole, which says there's no alternative to the European Union, and yet Germany is going down the drain.
I want to turn everything over here to the United States. Now, what's very interesting, just a couple of months ago, this is like October, November, December of 2018, the mainstream media was out there saying, okay, we know when the recession is going to happen. It's going to happen the latter part of 2020. And everything looked like that. The Fed was raising rates. Everything was falling apart. And then I see on the mainstream media, like the Bloomberg articles, that the recession might have been stopped because the Fed now is in a holding pattern and they're not going to be unwinding their balance sheet. So it seems like everything has been reversed somehow, some way, where we're not going to be entering into this recession. I'm not saying the economy is fantastic. We know that Trump has the ability, the same as Obama, to manipulate some of the numbers in government to make it look a lot better than it really is. And I think he's doing this on purpose. To hold everything together long enough to transition to something else. But, do you think the recession that they were calling for has been stopped by the Fed, which then in turn might lead to Trump?
Don't underestimate the power of the presidency in dealing with this situation. I think Trump made a threat to the Federal Reserve that they took as not just a question of interest rates, because many, many people know that Trump has talked at various times about why do we need the Fed? Why are these privileged banks in a position to control the money system of the United States and the debt system and profit from it? You know, there's an element of, I guess you could say, suspense. Would Trump fully move against the Fed? Because he certainly was making some fairly strong threats. And I think that was good. I'd like to see him do that. The problem is this: keeping interest rates low is not a solution, because all you're doing is building up the debt. And this is there's an economist from the former chief economist for the Bank for International Settlements, William White, who made an interesting point, which is that once you introduce quantitative easing and you take away risk from the banks and unleash incredible speculation, you can't just then tighten the screws and expect things will be the same as they were before. The old rules don't apply anymore. You mentioned that the Fed has a huge stockpile of debt instruments. What are they going to do with that? What happens if they hit the market at a point where there's a lot of other bad debt? Just let me give you a couple of statistics that just came out in a report from the OECD, which is a European-based financial economic institution. Their new report, which came out last week, pointed out that the global issuance of corporate bonds is now at $13 trillion, which is double where it was in 2008. And they go on to say that much of this is highly leveraged and that the companies face difficulties in servicing the debt if the interest rates go up at all, or if there's a lack of confidence and there's a run on some of these instruments. 54% of this corporate debt is now BBB rating or lower, which means it's one notch above junk rating. So if you have over half the corporate bonds in the Western financial system at virtual junk debt rating, you face a real possibility of a chain reaction collapse. Now, I think this OECD report is worth paying attention to, because it points to the weakness, what Lyndon LaRouche had been talking about for quite a while, which is that when you have debt on this level, you can't ultimately pay it by issuing more debt. The idea that somewhere someone is going to hit a winning streak that will give them enough money to cover the leverage, how do you do that? If everybody's caught in this spiral of debt, where do you go to make money? The only way you can get it is from the central banks, and the central banks don't know what to do. That's why the European Central Bank, the EU's bank, decided they would keep going with quantitative easing. I think Powell, the Federal Reserve Chairman, read the writing on the wall from Trump attacking him and also from the problem they were having with unraveling their holdings, and they lowered the rates, and they figure better to continue building up the debt and let the reckoning take place later rather than sooner. Now, that being said, the question of a stock market crash is still a real possibility, because the earnings don't match up with the appreciation of the stock levels, the total market capitalization of companies. mean, how do some of these companies now have close to $1 trillion in market value when they don't produce a damn thing? It's all paper. And what I'm concerned about is that I think Trump has to get ahead of this, because if he doesn't, there could be a pulling of the plug on the economy before the 2020 election. And I see that as almost as big a vulnerability as the whole Mueller-Russiagate story.
Yeah, I mean, right now we are seeing the Fed reverse its policies. And they're even talking about, if it's necessary, they'll lower the interest rates once again. And from my point of view, it looks like Trump and his administration, they set this in motion because they realized if the Fed continually raise rates and they continually unwinded their balance sheet,
that would lead to a crash.
Yeah, the whole thing would just completely crash. So now when I see everything reversing and everything going in the opposite direction, it seems like they're trying to hold off this crash that would have come in 2020. And I think what Trump is trying to do here is make it through the 2020 elections without the economy crashing. And I think this is why we see a reversal in what the Fed is doing right now. And I think they're trying to hold this off long enough so he can get back or stay in office and the whole thing doesn't fall apart around him.
Well, the problem you have with that is that you can't always predict or control these things. And a chain reaction collapse, as many people have said, is one bad derivatives deal away, a domino effect. The problem is that you have to deal with this debt, and the only way to deal with the debt is write a lot of it off. Much of this debt in terms of corporate debt is unpayable. Corporations are not making profits at nearly the level they need to pay off the debt. So why let them borrow more money? That's what the policy is right now. Look at families, the family debt, the private sector debt, the student debt, the card loan debt, the housing debt. These are all at near record levels. And people's incomes aren't going up high enough to cover it. So a billionaire may be able to pay for 10 new houses, but hundreds of families that are caught in the wage crunch and the loss of manufacturing jobs and things of that sort aren't able to cover their losses. So sooner or later, this thing is going to blow. And I think what Trump needs to do, as I say, by getting ahead of this, is to basically say, look, I'm being held hostage by these policies that were adopted under Bush and Obama. And we're doing our best to work our way through it. And we're trying to build up manufacturing again, but we're not going to be able to do it without writing off some of this debt. And the best starting point for him would be to go back to his 2016 campaign promise of Glass-Steagall and say, we're going to protect the commercial banks, but we're not going to protect the investment banks. There will be no more bailouts. No bail-ins will be allowed. And we're not going to have bail for any of the bankers who committed these swindles. And if he did that, he'd become a very popular figure, much more popular than these Democrats running around promising pie in the sky without any way of paying for it.
I think eventually he is going to do that. I don't know if he's able to do that in his first term. I think he's dealing with a lot more in his first term. And I think and this is my personal opinion, what I think he's trying to do is make it to the second term, which I think he will. And I think he's, planning to tackle that problem in his second term, because I do believe there are certain things that have to happen first. I mean, we hear the Cohen testimony in front of Congress, and you can see that was completely pre-planned.
Well, let's get to that, because this is really the other part of this picture.
Right.
Is that here you have Trump, who is carrying out a very significant, one might almost say brilliant strategic offensive with his meeting with Kim Jong-un. The statement he made going into it is, look, we're not going to end up with denuclearization today. We're in a process. We're in motion on this. We're making progress. They're not doing tests. There aren't missiles flying and bombs going off, but we do have a process underway. And he's done it with an alliance that includes Russia, China, Japan, and South Korea. So here he is in the midst of these delicate negotiations, making enormous progress where the brilliant genius Obama couldn't do anything except make the situation worse. Bush sabotaged the potential for diplomacy between South and North Korea. So Trump is doing that. Secondly, you have the China trade talks. Now, whatever anyone thinks about that, The reality is that we do have a problem with China. And as Trump says, it's not China cheating us, we cheated ourselves. The free trade agreements under Bush and Obama, the shutdown of American manufacturing, the offshoring of our jobs created an enormous problem for the United States, which can't be solved overnight. On top of that, China was engaged in some questionable practices on intellectual property and currency manipulations and so on. So he said to the Chinese, let's solve this. And as in the case of his dealings with Kim Jong-un, there were some tough words, but Trump developed a close personal relationship with China's leader, Xi Jinping, and now we're seeing this thing moving. So Trump showed flexibility. He moved the deadline for the next set of tariff increases so that this process can continue. You also have him following through on the withdrawal from Syria and the possible moves away from Afghanistan. Now, that's being somewhat undercut by Pentagon crazies and the neocons around him by still keeping some troops in Syria. But these three things alone are extraordinary developments. And there's also, I was just informed yesterday that there's a possible summit coming up with Putin in June to resolve the tension over the intermediate nuclear force agreement withdrawal by the U.S. So you have these four extraordinary strategic matters coming up at once. And what happens? The minute Trump leaves the country to go to Hanoi for the meetings with Kim Jong-un, you get the next phase of Russiagate. This the only term I can think that fits for Michael Cohen is schmuck. You got this pompous schmuck up there in front of a Congress of pompous schmucks going after Trump with a bunch of lies. You had the Manafort decision released by Mueller a few days earlier. You have all this speculation. When is the Mueller report coming out? This is unprecedented, this kind of legal sabotage of a president's strategic activity. Then you have people like Mitch McConnell siding with Schumer, passing legislation, which is non-binding, but a resolution opposing Trump's withdrawal of troops from Syria. And you had another bill put through which calls for a non-withdrawal of troops from South Korea. Trump never even talked about doing that. But that's designed to muddy the waters with South Korea. And then in the midst of the China negotiations, you have the Justice Department arresting the CFO of the Huawei technology company in China. You have Marco Rubio saying we're not going to buy any technology goods from China because they're going to spy on us. And Trump saying, look, we should make better products if we don't want to be dependent on China. So this is extraordinary, Dave, and I think people who are skeptical about Trump or not optimistic, or people who thought white knights were going to come in on white horses and round up all the bad guys, that's not going to happen that way. What's going to happen is that he's going to move the country based on taking some decisions, acting on some things, and it's up to the American people to hold the Democrats' feet to the fire and the Republicans' feet to the fire, because he's not getting much help from the Republican Party either.
No, I agree. I mean, I've always said this. He's standing pretty much alone. He's fighting against the neocons, the Republicans, the Democrats, the deep state, and he has all these people coming at him from all different sides. And he's trying to fight them off while making a deal, while draining the swamp, while doing everything. And this is not just snap your fingers and everything is perfect. This is a long haul to make everything right. And there are certain individuals in Congress and in other places, the FBI, Department of Justice, you name it, that don't want this to happen. And they're fighting him.
Well, look, I left out one of the important things, which was McCabe's grandstanding to sell his book.
Oh, yeah.
Who he openly admitted that they were plotting a coup against Trump. Now, what's interesting, and this is where you see the corruption of the media, McCabe said, well, this was in May 2017, right after Comey was fired, we opened up our investigation. Oh, no, their investigation was opened up in May 2016 by Comey, by Peter Strzok, by McCabe. It was done out of Andy's office, according to the Strzok page illicit text messaging. This was going on from during the election. That was illegal. And it was going on under the auspices of the CIA director, Brennan, who's a criminal, should be in prison. Clapper, the NSA director. If anyone's house should have been raided at 6 a.m. with 27 FBI agents, it should have been Clapper, who lied to the Congress about the extent to which the NSA was eavesdropping on every single American. That's a crime, what was being done, and then he lied about it. So the McCabe thing just highlights that we're having the unfolding of a slow coup, which is being run by Democrats on the ground, but was orchestrated out of the City of London. And why was that? Because the City of London, besides Brexit, the other thing that threatens them is the emergence of a new economic paradigm based on physical economy, what the Chinese are doing, what the Russians are doing, what the South Korea is doing, what India is doing. They're all creating credit, not to refinance bad debt, but to build things. They're moving away from the failed neoliberal system of the West. And instead of adjusting our own thinking or in changing our own policy, those elites in London and Washington and Wall Street are saying, no, we have to have the United States use its military power to stop this, to stop China, to stop Russia, to stop these other countries. And it's a losing fight because those countries are doing what's right. You know, there was all this talk about China's debt, and now the report comes out that their actual debt that's owed to banks is dropping because they're going into debt to build things. They're adding value to their economy. Western companies and Western countries are going into debt to cover existing costs and old debt. So they're building up a bigger debt than they already had. And they're saying we have to protect that debt with the power of our countries. And if that means going to war with Russia, going to war with China, we're going to do it. And this was the policy of Obama. This was the policy of Hillary Clinton. And Trump said, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to change it. So what do? They say he's a Putin puppet, that he's selling out the interests of the country to the Russians with no evidence. Mueller has produced no evidence. I just was at a conference where I got to meet with Bill Binney, the former NSA technical advisor, probably one of the most qualified people we've ever had at the NSA. And he said he's going to be releasing new information that shows that the so-called hacking by Russia was an inside job, was a move onto a flash drive. It was internal. He's not speculating about Seth Rich or who might have done it. He's just saying that technically it was impossible for it to have been a hack because if it was a hack, the NSA would have evidence of it. So the whole thing was concocted. And the fact that the FBI and the CIA gave credibility to this, gave credibility to this report by this ex-MI6 operative Christopher Steele, who was paid by the Clinton campaign. That's what's, Dave, this is so outrageous that you have the idea that if Roger Stone was trying to find out what WikiLeaks had on Hillary Clinton, that's a crime. But if Hillary pays a British intelligence operative to concoct a report from Russian intelligence to attack Trump, that somehow that's acceptable, but what Roger did is not. This is an extraordinary situation, the most incredible act of corruption that's ever occurred in the United States. And as you point out, Trump is fighting it. He's standing up. And so even if he makes mistakes, even if he has some bad people around him, like if I were advising him, I'd say fire Bolton and Pompeo tomorrow. The last thing we need is a war in Venezuela. But he's doing it his way, and we've got to support him on this. And that means not just sitting around eating popcorn watching the Cohen hearings, but going out and mobilizing your friends and tell them, here's what he's doing. Here's why we have to support this. And I think a lot of this now is on the American people to show the courage to stand up and defend a president who's fighting this corrupt, long-term implants in our government from whether you call it the deep state, the British Empire, whatever you call it, That's what it is. It's what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex.
So, I mean, right now, Trump, he has Barr as the attorney general right now. And Barr, William Barr, has said, okay, let's wrap up the Mueller investigation and let's produce this report. What do you think this Mueller report is going to show?
If it's honest, it's going to show that they have nothing on Russia except this phony indictment of 12 GRU agents picked out of the phone book. That's one thing they have. The other thing is they have Paul Manafort on the fact that he engaged in some possibly corrupt activities, but so did John Podesta's brother, Tony Podesta. So do many people who don't register as lobbyists, but they picked on Manafort. It will show that they were able to catch people on misstatements, the way the FBI does it, where they know what you actually said. They have the transcripts in front of them, and they, under pressure, cause you to make misstatements. And next thing you know, you're lying to the FBI, lying to the Congress. These are process crimes. I think Alan Dershowitz is absolutely right that these are crimes that occurred after the crime they're supposed to be investigating. They're crimes that were created by the special counsel. Now, that's what's going to be in his report. And, maybe he'll put in there that Michael Cohen claims that Roger Stone talked to Julian Assange, which I don't think Mueller is stupid enough to put in his report because he knows it's not true. So I don't think there'll be much in the report. I don't think that's going to stop people like Adam Schiff or Maxine Waters or some of these unhinged Democrats. I mean, Bernie Sanders sounded like a madman when he announced his presidency, attacking Trump. So I think we're headed for a really nasty campaign. But you know what the main thing Trump has going for him? There are two things. One is the American people are a little wiser now than they were even in 2016. And they know you can't trust a lot of the media. You can't trust most politicians. But also the Democrats are talking about the stellar field of candidates. What a joke. I mean, what has Cory Booker done? What has Kamala Harris done? Harris sabotaged a real investigation into the corruption in 2008. None of these people have a leg to stand on. And I think Trump is going to come out and unless they can convince 10 or so Republicans to join with the Democrats in the Senate, if there's an impeachment bill in the House, to throw him out of office, I think he'll beat them in 2020. But I think he really has to take on this economic question we were talking about earlier, and then continue what he's doing on the strategic side of things and let people know that had Hillary been in, we'd probably have been in 3 wars since the election, and maybe one of them would have been a nuclear war.
Yeah, I think we would have been in a war if Clinton was in the presidency. Now, once Mueller's report comes out, and I didn't hear you say Russian collusion, so we already know the Senate and the House already said, yeah, we haven't seen anything that says Russian collusion whatsoever. Trump still has the D-class and the OIG.
Yes.
Do you think he's going to play that hand?
Well, I think he has to do it quickly. This idea that he can wait till 2020 and then spring it on the American people, part of that is based on the idea that the American people don't have much of an attention span, and if you do it now, they'll forget it by 2020. I don't buy that. I think people would be quite relieved to know that there's documentation that there was a coup in process. And it has to be packaged right. You do the declassification along with what McCabe told 60 Minutes, along with what's in these text messages from 2 top FBI officials. I mean, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were top officials. Handfuls of others. Sally Yates, she acted irresponsibly in giving the go-ahead for these things. The FISA documents, the FISA warrants. You put that together as a package, and you get someone who can explain it clearly. Maybe Trump can do it. Maybe Barr can do it. I certainly could do it. You go through why they tried to keep him out, the so-called insurance package that you develop this case in case he wins, and that this is what the Brennan and Clapper and Obama were all involved in. And I think if they use that with the declassification, the American people would look at it and say, this is a whole lot worse than what we read from Kenneth Starr's report on Monica Lewinsky. If you think about it, think of the details that went into the Clinton-Lewinsky report that came out. Why not do that with the operation against Trump? Show people what it really was. And so I would advise him not to wait till the summer of 2020 or the fall of 2020. Go with it now. Let's clear the decks. Let's have prosecutions start to occur of people like Brennan and Clapper. You want to talk about collusion? Brennan colluded with GCHQ, the British equivalent of the NSA, to concoct a phony report on Russian meddling and Trump collusion. What about the Clinton campaign paying Christopher Steele to write a fake dossier? Now, by the way, one thing I did see is that Cohen admitted that he wasn't in Prague, which was one of the things that people were saying was in the Steele report, that Cohen went there to pay off the Russians, and that this has now been confirmed. No, it's not confirmed. It's part of the lies that were packaged in this report by Christopher Steele. So let's get it all out there. And if it's too much detail for the American people, fine. At least give them the picture so they know that the same people who were involved in deregulating the financial system, in building up the debt bubble in housing that blew up in 2008, that knocked out about 1/3 of Americans' wealth, that's doing it again, that same network was responsible for the so-called Russiagate story. And I think that's the kind of cleansing that we need.
So do I. I think he has to cleanse all the individuals in the FBI, which, as you can see, a lot of people have been fired. A lot of people have resigned. Same thing with the Department of Justice. Same thing with throughout government and Congress. I mean, I feel like we have so many individuals still in Congress that are so corrupt, that are so bad for this country, that a lot of these individuals need to be removed from their position. And when you watch...
One thing that just came out, which I think is really useful, is this poor, crazy woman, Ocasio-Cortez, who said that one of the reasons we need the Green New Deal is that people shouldn't have babies. And, what we at LaRouche PAC have argued for the last 40 years is the whole environmentalist movement is not just anti-growth and anti-technology, it's anti-human. It's against people. And that this is what they're protecting by going after Trump. And you now have this 9-month abortion laws that are coming into being in New York State and Virginia. We're seeing the true nature of this enemy. These are the people who defended the colonial policies in Africa that led to so many deaths, unnecessary deaths, malnutrition, starvation. This is what the British did in India with the mass starvation, the Irish potato famine. If people get the history of this and realize that there's a faction of the elites in the world that control banking and have, especially since the since the assassination of Kennedy and then the eclipse of Reagan by Bush Sr., that these people have controlled government, and they've controlled not just elected government but the institutions of government. And their policies are anti-human, not just anti-American, they're anti-human. And the extent to which we get that point across, and we can use this Green New Deal as a perfect example of that. If you cut out fossil fuel use in the United States, what would have happened last month with the so-called polar vortex? You would have had people freezing to death in the upper Midwest, because you don't have enough electricity if you don't have nuclear plants and coal plants. So I think we have the truth is on our side. The question is, do we have people courageous enough to fight? And at least on the key issues of the strategic questions and who's running this operation, Trump has fought. And for that, he deserves our support, and not just our support, but our active involvement.
I agree. Harley, thank you very much for being on.